All right, welcome everybody. I have just met Pascal Coppens here at a event in Germany, and Pascal is a fellow keynote speaker. And maybe you introduce yourself quickly with just a couple of words, Pascal.
Well, yeah, I'm a keynote speaker right now, but I used to be an entrepreneur for 20 years in China, living 20 years in Shanghai mostly. Came back in 2018, and now I'm talking about my experiences there.
Yeah, and I've been following your work mainly on YouTube. By the way, people should go and look up the YouTube channel Pascal's China Lens or Pascal Coppens. That's the way how you can find him. And this was the first time that I've experienced you speaking in public, like your keynote about China. And you also have published a book, right, about a topic, which was also the topic of the day. Can we trust China, right?
I actually published two books.
Yeah.
The first one was China's New Normal, which is about innovation, and the one that I talked about today is all about trust. And can we trust China is the question of the book. Yep.
Great. Perfect, because these are two topics like innovation and trust, which I think are very relevant to an audience of investors, because actually regarding the trust, I would say we have a visible line of trust, which is shown as the stock market performance. If you speak of Chinese stocks, like individual stocks, but also let's say the Hang Seng index and so on, obviously that one has gone down for various reasons. We don't need to discuss this. But what I would like to ask from you, Pascal, is your opinion maybe on the issue of trust between China and the West, and how this might be reflected even in the stock market.
Yeah. Well, in the stock market, that's always difficult because there's different reasons why things happen. You know that better than I do. But for me, as a society and as a change, I think trust is really about what you read and what you hear as information that feeds on how you see the country or see something that is not familiar to you. And China is very typical, an area where our coverage of China is usually not too positive, and so the trust level is going down. And so I've talked a lot today about the fact that in order to figure out what is really happening in China and to trust both the Chinese as well as the system as well as the companies that are going for the future, I think we need to understand more what their ambitions are, and I think we need to look from the inside out. And so this is really what it's all about. It's about getting that what I call China lens, which is also on my YouTube channel, and understand what the Chinese want to achieve. And as I always say, is that China is very cyclical, and we've had 3 years of downward cycle almost, both technology, politically as well as economically. I mean, there's lots of challenges that we've had over the past 3 years, and China definitely. If you think about 2022, it's been a terrible year for China. But now it seems to be coming back, and now it's important to not be misled too much by the information we're getting from people that are not included or not informed about how China is actually transforming right now. So I see trust being related to the upward cycle right now.
All right, so you think maybe that's also something I have been saying in the last couple of weeks, actually, because I was coming back from China currently, and I think like this is maybe a long-term positive move now that people can ultimately go to China again, which should help for establishing trust again, right?
Of course. I mean, China, in my view, is all about people wanting to meet face-to-face to do business together. I mean, this is part of the culture, and so not having seen or being able to go to China for 3 years has created our own narrative and our own ideas about the country. And some of it is true, but some of it is actually something we made up because we weren't able to verify all of the facts that we saw there. And so the only thing we can do is go back and then create that human connection between Chinese and us and between the people to figure out what they think. And do they see China rebounding? Do they see China going positive? Are there 274 million people that were traveling again last week at the May holidays? I mean, is that just because they like to travel, or is there something more happening? So I think going back we'll see the upward cycle coming back. But I don't want to say that everything's positive. What I do want to say is that the aspirations and the hope for the future is a trend that went from negative to, again, going back to positive.
And I think for some of the negativity, China was also, fair to say, responsible, right?
Of course.
And now, what do you say, what should be some signals or things that China should consider in order to gain back some trust, some steps?
Well, I think if you look at what China has been doing diplomatically the last weeks with Europe specifically, I mean, they've been sending diplomats everywhere to try and figure out how to work together. So in every country in Europe. In the US it's still a challenge, but there are discussions going on. So the last weeks is really changing. And I think there is, again, that dialogue that is starting to slowly get back together. You see people at the top level in China, as well as in the US, as well as in Europe, now starting to figure out what are we going to do with the future, but also what are we going to do with the problems that we have today. I mean, think about the war in Ukraine and all the other crises that we're faced with, even in the technology field. I mean, layoffs in the US and in China, and so how are we going to deal with all that? And I think the diplomatic route is now back open, which can only be positive. I don't see any... The lack of communication is really what the biggest danger is for the trust, but also for the future of dealing with China.
Now, on this channel, I mostly discuss Chinese tech companies because personally, I am passionate about it and I've seen it with my own eyes. Lots of viewers maybe haven't been to China, and I think there's also the stereotypical idea that China is not innovative. And I think you have got some great content on your channel about China and how they innovate.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a book about it, 300 pages about innovation in China. I've gotten lots of videos on my channel on how China's innovating, why they're innovating, how they're innovating in a different way, what we should be watching. And so, I mean, there's so many things. It's not that they do things better than we do, they just do it different. And for certain industries, for certain things, it actually helps them to go faster. For other things, it's more challenging, and so we just have to watch where both Beijing is putting the focus on and how companies are using that path to actually help their own development. But at the same time, we need to understand what the entrepreneurs want. And I always say China is driven more by the bottom up, the entrepreneurs, than it's driven by Beijing. Beijing is usually just giving the direction and say, we're going to spend a few billion or $1 trillion there, and so everybody wants that money. But ultimately, it's the entrepreneurs that are making the change happen.
And how do you think they are going to respond to the current challenges when it's around artificial intelligence and they're being cut off, like from the chips and so on? Like, how are they going to handle, in your views, from a Chinese entrepreneurial perspective, those type of new challenges in this world? Yeah,
I mean, these are two different things. If you talk about AI, I think what we're missing very often is that China is much more responsible when it comes to AI and the challenges of AI than we think. There's a lot of regulation happening. Companies have to abide with it. Of course, that doesn't mean that Beijing needs to follow all these regulations themselves, but for the other 99.999% of the people in China, that is actually a good thing, that there's more regulation to make sure that AI is used for good. That is one thing. So there's a lot more positive regulation happening, just like in Europe. I think China is ahead of the US in terms of AI regulation, and probably at the same level or maybe just behind Europe when it comes to that. So that's one part. By the way, if I can add something there, maybe the viewers are not aware of the fact that even there is even public opinion for new AI regulation, right? So they have this small window when they open the debate to the public and get it in, the feedback before publishing such regulation, right? Yes, so it's clear that there's an inclusiveness in making sure that they get the right rules and regulation. And so I think that will only benefit the entrepreneurs to build new things. So that's for sure one of the areas that we should watch when it comes to AI. But otherwise, I think the whole idea of innovation in China is really now driven by more global sentiment. So if you look at electrical vehicles, for example, or any industry that is going really hot in China, I mean, this is not about China anymore, this is about the world. And so I think China is looking at the world as the market more than just at China, and that's something we need to be aware of.
Right, and you said like the chips part, this is like a second issue. How do you think about
the
this?
chips, and that's of course very relevant because since in November Biden signed the Chip Act and basically limited most companies, tech companies in China, to get access to chips, get access to talent, access to equipment, to tools, to software. There's only one thing China can do is to build their own. And so they are forced to build their own. And so what is 100% sure in my view is that they're going to try and do it. Whether they will achieve it and succeed and actually leapfrog ahead of us, that is still out in the future. I mean, that we don't know. And for some things they will and for other things they won't. But we have forced them to go there. And so if you look at the past 30, 40 years, I mean, many times we've said, yeah, the Chinese won't be able to do it, and then later on we figure out they did it. And so the chances that China will build their own chip industry is pretty high. Yeah. And I would have to have a crystal ball to figure out when China would be competing with us on the most high-end chips. Some people say 2 years, some people say 10 years or 50 years. It's really hard to say. But we are going to get competition. That is for sure.
Maybe you can put your comments down below, say what you think, whether or not China can catch up, or what you think might be the date on which they are on par with the West in these regards. Anyways, please feel free to follow Pascal on these such kind of topics and insights. Thank you, Pascal. It was really insightful.
Yeah. Great,
and hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like and see you in our next video.